Network.
Thank you very much, Justin. And it's great to have the Brewing Network involved with really any event. A little personal side note to start off, I basically learned how to brew by listening to the content on the Brewing Network, so that's really cool.
I did too. Same here.
Chase and I are going to be talking about spontaneous fermentation, which is one of the most nearest and dearest styles of beer making to us, one that we're really, really excited about, and we're psyched to see a packed house here for this session. You're going to get to taste some beers that are extremely rare. I mean, all three of the beers they're going to taste from us haven't even been released yet. They've been just a very, very long time in the making. So what we're going to do is kind of go over the process and philosophy behind these beers, have you taste them, and then try to leave a good chunk of time for your questions. So before we launch into the process and philosophy, Chase, do you want to say anything?
Amazing to be here, guys. I really, really appreciate you all coming to sit in this little corner of the GABF. It's very exciting out there, but for you to spend a little bit of time with us, thank you very much. Yeah, my name is Chase Elam, the founder of Prairie Artisan Ales, and as of a month ago, American Solera. So it's a new project with quite a large focus on the beers that we're going to be trying today.
Right on. And in case you didn't, I know Justin introduced me. I'm the founder of Jester King Brewery in Austin, Texas. Any Texans in the crowd? Wow.
What's the score right now? Anyone? Is it over?
Who won?
Good.
Oh, you won? Okay. That's
good.
Fine. I don't care.
I did graduate from there, so I can be proud.
Chase cares more than me, so I'm glad. All right. So spontaneous fermentation, what is it? For us, it's beer where we're not actually pitching yeast. The vast majority you're ever going to taste, yeast is being physically added to the wort to cause it to ferment. Chase and I have both taken a very, very traditional approach to making spontaneously fermented beer. Our biggest inspiration, and I'm sure a lot of these breweries are breweries you all love and know well, like us, but we were inspired by the traditional lambic and goose makers out there, like Cantillon and Dreifonteinen and Girardin and Eau de Beersel, like these classic lambic makers. And I think the cool thing for me about this style of beer is that it really is a reflection of a time and place. I mean, we're in a beer world right now where advances in modern technology have basically made it possible to drink the same beer practically anywhere in the world, which I think is a very cool thing. What I think, needs to be not forgotten along the way is that connection to a time and place. So basically my inspiration was tasting, classic goose and lambic and kriek and framboise and wanting to use that process, but do it in Texas with our own raw well water, local grains, native barley and wheat, aged hops from our barn, and then whatever microbes just kind of float into the room during the overnight inoculation. So to us, that's really creating that reflection of place and time, making something that could only exist due to the conditions on one night of the year at one place, never to be recreated again. I think that's a cool thing in the brewing world, and it kind of speaks to that concept of terroir in beer, which I think, the winemakers kind of have the upper hand for now with that, and so we're trying to kind of take back some of that ground.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what Jeff said is really what got me into it. It's trying these classic styles and these amazing beers, and the big thing for us, and when I started, even with Prairie, like pursuing farmhouse beer, was this idea of just like really refreshing, delicious beer that was incredibly complex. And I think mostly as a brewer that is in there every day doing the sweaty work, is pursuing styles that are challenging and exciting, and maybe trying to be a little unlike all the brewers are out here. There's a lot of them, and when you're a little brewery in Oklahoma, trying to find a place to stand out can be a challenge. So that was really a goal for me as far as pursuing these types of beers, was find a way that maybe I could make an impact, even though I'm kind of small and less important, I suppose.
Cool. So I'm going to tell you about the first beer you're tasting right now, which is our first ever 100% spontaneously fermented beer. We are debuting it here, or a little sneak preview of it here at GABF. And we followed, like I said, a very traditional approach. So we did a turbid mash with well water, about 60% malted barley from Blacklands malt, which is in the Austin area, and about 40% just raw Texas-grown wheat. The turbid mash involves a number of different transfers and temperature rests. It creates this like very like chalky, milky, like almost viscous wort. Like the first runnings from the mash are literally the color of milk, like bright white. And then from there, we'll do an extended boil with aged hops. And then we'll knock out to this vessel called a cool ship, where we let the wort sit out overnight. We open up the doors, the windows, allow ambient microflora to just waft into the room, inoculate the wort. We then drain the cool ship, move the wort into barrels the next morning, and allow that beer to ferment spontaneously. We started our program of spontaneous fermentation in February of 2013. We've done spontaneous fermentation every winter since. We're in a very hot weather climate, by the way, and a lot of brewers said like this won't even work out in Texas because we get like overnight lows in the 30s or 40s on maybe like a dozen nights a year, and that's it. But we wait for those nights to roll around, and we, like I said, inoculate the wort. And we did a blend of 2013, 14, and 15, which was inspired by that tradition of goose. And then we've had that beer in bottles since February of this year, and we're just starting to now share it with beer drinkers. So I hope you dig it. Yeah, it's just, I mean, we don't call it a goose out of respect to the Belgian lambic and goose makers, but it is a spontaneously fermented beer inspired by that tradition.
Yeah. How soon before you just start pouring it? Whatever. So my approach is similar and different to a lot of things that Jester King is doing with their beer. The big thing is I tend to not do a turbid mash. I have a relatively low-tech brewing system. It's a 10-barrel, as manual as it comes kind of brew house, although I have a new one coming in December that'll change things for me. But more or less out of necessity for what I'm able to achieve in my brew house, I've stayed away from that and still do 60% Pilsner, but my 40% wheat does have a mix of malted and unmalted wheat in it, which is just a little bit, I don't know, it works for me. It's just been the process I started with. Not that I'm opposed to doing the turbid mash, but it's just kind of a step that I've gone with my beer. I started our spontaneous program about 6 or 7, maybe 8 months after they did in the fall 2013. We had a milk tank that we converted into a cool ship and put it in the back of my pickup truck and released a Verse Beer cool ship truck, which was here like a couple of GABFs ago, a little bit around town. Kind of a silly beer we did with our friends at Evil Twin. But since then, we've upgraded to a much larger cool ship, and every winter in Oklahoma, when it gets below 40 degrees, I start brewing these beers to put away in oak. Another way where we're different and where I stray away a little bit from the word spontaneous is I do several runs that are spontaneous and go into new oak. But as I've built my wood cellar, I've created a series of really large casks that you might see like in the Boone brewery in Belgium. And for those, I'm using more of a Solera style, where here in a few months I'll start emptying those, but won't rinse, and we'll just next day put the wort in. And again, just a process that makes it a little easier for me. I work in a brewery by myself, and where I can do things to kind of help myself along, I do. So I'm slightly less traditional in a couple of senses, but the beer that they're pouring for you now is Western Culture. Is a blend of beer from two different, a 2-year-old and a 1-year-old barrel, large puncheon style, like Portuguese barrels. And an interesting thing about the beer is a process we're kind of learning is that when you're collecting the wort the next day, it really is a good process to use a mixing tank prior to going into your barrels. And that's something I just didn't realize back then. And so I had a couple of different barrels where I wasn't realizing that process, and some would be nice and sour, others would be bread heavy, and I just wasn't getting a very cohesive run into my barrels, which is fun for blending now. I've got a whole bunch of them to pick from that vary in degrees of sourness and bread character, funkiness, But for this one, it was taking one of those more sour barrels and then one of the more Brett heavy ones to try to make a beer that was ultimately pretty balanced and not overly sour at all.
Very cool. One thing I'd point out about our unfruited, spontaneously fermented beer, and by the way, the next two beers you'll get to try are our fruit re-fermentations of our spontaneously fermented beer, which I don't think I've actually told anyone we've been doing that, but I mean, you can probably guess that we would do that. We like to work with a lot of fruit at Jester King. But before we move on to talking about those beers, another thing I'd point out with our spontaneously fermented beer, and I would say this is true of, not to speak for Chase, but true of Western culture as well, is, we like to use a lot of aged hops in our beer. And so we take these bright, green, fresh, floral hops, we take them out of cold storage, put them into a burlap bag, and let those bags just sit in the attic of a horse barn for a couple years before we use them, and they get really just brown and kind of wilted, and they smell kind of funky and cheesy and barnyardy. And I think a lot of that kind of like classic kind of goose aroma, I think is largely attributed to those aged hops. And I really love the character of aged hops. I mean, I love fresh hops too. I love, IPA that, tastes like orange juice, but I like these kind of like funky old hops as well. And so we use a lot of that in our spontaneously fermented beer. And then also another thing that I think is very important is bottle conditioning. I wouldn't say, I'll speak not just for spontaneously fermented beers, but really any kind of like mixed culture, farmhouse or sour beers. I think extended maturation in the bottle can really create some really beautiful, integrated flavors and aromas, and a lot of those kind of like classic, kind of funky, maybe Brettanomyces driven aromas really take time to produce in the bottle over, maybe 4 months, 5 months, maybe even a year in some cases. So that's, I think kind of one of the straightforward, but maybe like under the radar things that I think is very critical to these styles is just extended bottle maturation.
Yeah, my beer has been in the bottle for just almost a year. It was bottled in late October, maybe the first part of November, probably late October of last year. And that's a bottle conditioning these beers is a challenge. Coming from doing less aged farmhouse beers and stuff, really dialing that in. And this beer, Western Culture, I think is probably a little lower carbonation than I really would like it to be. But when you're just kind of going for it on stuff, once it's in the bottle, it's kind of locked in. So I think it's still fantastic, and I'm proud of it. But that's definitely been a challenge that I've faced with ours, is really making sure that we're dialing in that process, because it's just a new approach when you're dealing with these much older beers.
Yeah, we do add priming sugar to our spontaneously fermented beer. We're very careful not to add any yeast for bottle conditioning. To us, that would make it no longer a spontaneously fermented beer. But we add about 5 grams of priming sugar to every bottle that's bottled. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about fruit re-fermentation. The next beer that's going to come out is some of our spontaneously fermented beer that's re-fermented with peaches and apricots. We try to use local fruit whenever we can. We have really great peaches just down the road from us in Texas. Apricots we have to go out of state to get. We get those from California. The whole principle behind our use of fruit is to actually ferment the fruit. I always like to ask people to think about the difference between, grape juice and wine. Why does wine have all these complexities to it that grape juice does not? That's because it's been fermented. So same principle with our use of fruit in our beer. We add real fruit. We don't work with any flavorings or concentrates or anything artificial. It's always real fruit. And we take that fruit, we add it to the beer, then we allow another fermentation to occur. We're taking beer. In this case, what's coming out right now with the spontaneous peach apricot is barrels that were anywhere from about 18 to 26 months old. So some really, really old beer from our cellar. We took that beer, we created a blend, then we moved that blend on top of peaches and apricots and let the fruit and the beer kind of intermingle for about a month allow the sugars in the fruit to be broken down to create fruit beer that's very dry and tart. I mean, a lot of times in the beer world, like I'll say, something's not better or worse, it's just different. For me, in my opinion, fruit beer where you're actually fermenting the fruit, I think is much better and interesting than just filtered and pasteurized beer with a concentrate or an artificial flavoring added to it. To me, that's 1 + 1 = 2. This, I think, is something that is greater than the sum of the parts, where we're actually fermenting the fruit to hopefully create some new flavors. Peach and apricots, both stone fruits, I think they go well together, so that's why we created this blend. All we simply do to process the fruit is cut or tear open the fruit, remove the pits, and then toss the halves into the beer and let it ferment, like I said. Do you want to speak a little bit to fruit re-fermentation too?
That's definitely been a big approach for us, and we will this fall start using our coolship beer to be producing these types of beers. It takes so long to really build up stock of beer that you're ready to start making decisions with. So I'll rack 100 barrels worth of beer this year that we've used our coolship for fermentation and process, and 100 barrels of just regular, straight beer would be a little much. So I'll be probably taking that into quarters or so and doing different fruit projects with it. And something that we've been pursuing here this year with the American Solera beers, if you've had a chance to try any, is re-fermentation on whole fruit and whole fruit only. For local, we've been able to do peaches, which I'll have come out next month. In Oklahoma, there are 35 different species of peaches, which I had no idea about. But it's exciting to dive into these fruits and try to pull out differences like that. Next year, we'll probably do an early and a late season peach beer just to embrace the variety that's grown there. But it's definitely become a major part of our process, and we'll be adding not just our golden sour beer, but our Western culture beer to those fruits here probably about any time now. I'm lining up all the stuff to get a few things going at least.
Very cool. So the next beer, I'll speak to it, even though the peach and apricot is coming around right now. The other beer we're going to try from our spontaneous fermentation program is our re-fermentation with raspberries and cherries. We're inspired by one of our favorite beers, kind of one of the white whales of the beer world, the Dre Fontainen Homage, which is a lambic re-fermented with cherries and raspberries. So that's going to be the fourth and final beer you'll get to try today. Speaking of, I've mentioned lambic several times now. It's kind of a fine line for American brewers to try to walk, where we want to be respectful of this tradition. We don't want to rip off the appellation. Lambic, I think, is one of the styles of beer that is most connected to place, more so than any other. I think you can draw an analogy with champagne. I mean, the champagne producers are very protective of their appellation. If it's not from that region, well, then they actually have legal protections in place to keep it from being called champagne. There's no really legal protections that keep anyone from calling their beer lambic or goose. And I haven't made the full rounds today, but you'll probably see some beers out there that are referred to as lambic here on the floor today, and that's something that I personally disagree with. I mean, I know that, yeah, that's good timing, but no, I mean, lambic is an appellation. I mean, these beers hailed centuries ago from Brussels and the Zena Valley and the Piemonte, and these are, like I said, beers that are very much tried to place. So not only would it be, I think, inappropriate for us in Austin, Texas at Jester King to call our beer lambic or goose, the flip side of that coin is we're making something that's unique to our location, and I don't want people, from outside of our region to be able to say, well, this is like hill country spontaneously fermented beer. It's not. So anyway, that's kind of like this little side discussion that kind of envelops this style of beer making, which I think is interesting.
As we're on the topic of kind of a sense of place, an interesting project that we're actually working on starts to somewhat bend those rules a little bit. we'll let them finish. Maybe they're done. So a project that we've been working on and started earlier towards the beginning of this year is a road trip project. And I believe we're working on changing the name of it, but originally it was a Cool Ship road trip. And earlier this year, we brewed wort at each other's facilities and ran them through our Cool Ship, and then the next morning loaded it into a trailer, into tanks, and drove it to each other's facilities, and are aging each other's beers in each other's breweries. And it's something I think we're going to hope to continue to do here for the next couple years, and maybe, I don't know, here in another couple years we'll actually have something to show for it. But I think it's a fun way for us to play on the idea of maybe creating a connection between both of our senses of place.
Absolutely, and unlike the football rivalry taking place today between Texas and Oklahoma, we have a very cooperative, really just wonderful relationship with American Solera, and it's been fun to actually just basically doing kind of like culture swaps, where, as Chase mentioned, we're taking the native yeast from Austin, trucking it up to Arizona, Oklahoma sorry. And then vice versa. Yeah, we so Chase and I had like a 8-hour road trip with about like 2,000 pounds of wort from our Cool Ships in the back of the truck, and we went through some snowstorms.
Yeah, somehow it snowed.
Yeah. And fortunately we made it, and but anyway, I think we have about like 15 minutes left, and given that this is like a very kind of process-driven talk where we're talking about this style of beer and the history behind it and how it's made, I wanted to make sure we're giving plenty of time for questions. So, yeah, Justin, how would you like to handle questions?
Anybody just raise your hand. I'll come over to you, and you can ask that way. Here's first one.
Hi, guys. Just a simple question. I just was curious on your approach to blending your beers and how you approach that.
I think the biggest thing that we're careful of is just not letting these beers get too sour, and trying to really strike a balance. And you do that with just vintages and different years. And really, honestly, for me, it's different barrels. I've got this beer in barrels that are 25 hectoliter, several feet around, to 59-gallon wine barrels. So all of them are producing different character for us, but ultimately it's just seeking to hit balance with our beer, because especially when you're doing these fruit beers, is you're going to pick up a lot of acid from the fruit that you're using, so you're already not seeking out overly acidic beer, but ultimately we're looking for balance.
Absolutely, I would wholeheartedly echo Chase's comments there. I mean, we get referred to a lot as a sour beer maker, and I'm totally comfortable with that. That doesn't bother me a bit. But we're not seeking acidity just for acidity's sake. It's kind of like cooking. I mean, you want acidity as a way to balance the overall flavor profile. And I think for the beers we blend at Jester King, they don't really strike the palate or strike the balance to be really, really acid driven. They're not. I think the acidity is very, very soft. And going along with this, and actually I think this has been a big improvement that we've seen in American craft brewing, is that I see a lot less acetic beer out there today. Maybe 3 or 4 years ago at GABF, I'd try a barrel-aged sour beer, and I'm kind of bracing to taste vinegar. I'm getting that a lot less, and I think that your palates as consumers have kind of demanded that. Certainly our philosophy is oriented along making beer that has kind of like soft, bright, drinkable acidity, because after all, I think if you're making Pilsner or Bock or spontaneously fermented beer, bottom line, make it drinkable. Make it so you can have one glass and you actually want to drink another. That's kind of like, I think, just a baseline rule for any brewer. So blending to balance the acidity is really what that's all about.
Are you monitoring your pH levels in the barrel? Are you looking for specific pHs?
Not really. It's just mostly for me when I'm going through these barrels, and in another couple months I'll be pulling samples from everything. And not that I'm not tasting this stuff once a month, but I'm looking to create balance just through my palate more than anything too scientific about it. Although in the early stages, as like I've been filling all my large casks, I do tend to track those as we're in what is more or less an initial primary fermentation that's occurring with these beers that happens within the first week or so of inoculation. And we're seeing most of the gravity drop there. And so through that process, I tend to track it. And then as the barrels get older, closer to a year, it's much more sensory driven.
Same for us. We're not tracking pH during the fermentation. We don't have an in-house lab at Jester King. We'll create the blend, put it into bottles, send that bottle off to a lab so we know a little bit more about the beer, like the pH and the IBU and the ABV. But otherwise, these beers, and I think this is the same thing for Chase and a lot of other kind of American farmhouse or sour ale makers. These are beers that are very, very, very driven by sensory approach. And I often think that with these blended styles of mixed culture fermentation or spontaneous fermentation, I really think actually what you're buying as beer drinkers is our palate. What you're tasting is an expression of our own palates. And I think that's very true for the wine world as well. And so, yes, very, very sensory driven. And, nothing against technical beer. I mean, I love my Pilsner to just taste the same way every time. And I think that's wonderful. But for these kind of mixed culture, more yeast driven styles, yeah, I think kind of embracing natural variation, natural inconsistency is a lot of fun and can lead to some beautiful results.
Hi, I had a question regarding your quality control. I know you're dealing with microflora. Is there anything you guys do to affect the biology of the microbes living in your brew houses? Because obviously you guys have a variety of things going on with the environment. And my question is, what kind of things do you affect? Are you growing certain type of trees or fruits or something like that to affect Lactobacillus, Pediococcus, Brettanomyces growth in your brew houses?
You can start with that.
Yeah, we do try to kind of create a healthy environment in the barrel room for yeast and bacteria to live. For instance, we've built a wooden roof and wooden walls all around the cool ship. The idea is to harbor as many microorganisms as possible. We also allow the barrels to kreuzen and allow that kreuzen to just flow out of the bung of the barrel and just kind of plume down the sides. And we intentionally don't clean that kreuzen up. We let it dry and allow that dried yeast to be incorporated into the room. I think the room is very important as far as inoculating these beers as well. And finally, this is kind of one thing we notice during our cool ship season is that we see kind of the momentum of the microbes, the momentum of fermentation kind of pick up, where like the lag time for the first couple cool ship batches is maybe like 4 or 5 days. But by the time the season is close to being over, the wort is almost fermenting the next morning after the wort is chilled in the cool ship, and it's starting to kreuzen within like 24 hours. So you see this like microbial momentum happening.
The big thing for me with that is our cool ship is completely outside, so just completely exposed, although sometimes I'll put some party tents above it just to be careful, but it's really, we don't do it unless we're in the 30s or lower, so our exposure to crap or leaves or whatever is pretty low. But the biggest thing for me in my brewery is that I've created a space where these beers live, and try not to affect it much, but I have a separate building for making other styles of beer, because while I'm really passionate about these beers, as a brewer, I inherently want to still kind of make a lot of things, and maybe my ways will change, but like I like dank-ass IPAs, like, so sue me. So I feel like I've got to try to still brew some of those just to have in the tap room because I enjoy drinking them. So for me, it is still creating separation with different equipment as well, so I kind of have my environment, and then I have my other spot too. So for me, it's just trying to achieve both, which maybe I'll give up on one day, but for now, I'm going to keep trying.
I was going to say, you guys mentioned that you're using a very natural and albeit inconsistent process. Obviously, some stuff that you produce is going to end up tasting amazing after you blend it. About how many barrels do you have to end up dumping in the course of a given batch? Like, what's your loss through that whole process?
to not be able to bring myself to dump stuff, and not that it's because I'm using it, it's because it just tends to sit in my brewery and never go anywhere. So as I've pretty much ran out of room, I need to start making those kind of hard decisions on barrels I'm just not stoked about, or have gone too acetic, or just have never really gone anywhere. Because there's some batches where like I was super aggressive with my hopping rates, and they just never really developed. And I feel like the stuff I did last season, about a year ago, I'm really happy with where it's going. But stuff from 2 years ago, some of it I love, and some of it I'm just like, I don't know what I'm going to do with it. And so this fall is probably where I'm going to have to start making those hard decisions on what I just have to let go of.
We've dumped about 10 to 20% of our stock every year. Our first year ever as a brewer, we dumped about half of our beer. One thing we see, as Chase referenced, is a lot of like acetic acid, that vinegariness. And some of our 3-year-old beer from our first spontaneous fermentation season in 2013, we held it back just to kind of see how it would mature in the year 4 and year 5. And unfortunately, I think possibly due to kind of the evaporation and the kind of the more kind of space in the barrel for oxygen, even with the protection of the pellicle on top of the beer, we're starting to see some kind of off notes, not just acetic, but also kind of like butyric, kind of like garbagey. So
Yum.
Unfortunately, some of the oldest spontaneous stock that we have that we didn't blend is probably going to get dumped.
I've got a question for you then. Do you feel like within these styles, is there room for any acetic character in the beers?
Yeah, personally, I think this is kind of relates to, beer, I think being a product of both time, place, and people, because obviously the human element comes into blending these beers. And, for me at Jester King, I really just kind of abhor acetic acid. I hate it. And so for us in our spontaneously fermented beers, we really try to avoid it at all cost. With that said, I've had some lambic from like Hansen's that had, or a little bit of acetic character to it that I thought was kind of nice. And obviously, like with the Flanders tradition, like a little bit of vinegariness can be pleasant. So I think it's a fine line, but we try to really avoid it.
It could just get out of control if you're not careful, I suppose.
Hey, thanks, guys. Longtime homebrewer, do you have any tips or suggestions on trying to do this on a smaller scale or a home brewing scale?
Let her rip is the biggest thing. Hopsdirect.com sells aged hops. You can get yourself a small amount. We use 0.8 pounds per barrel of beer, so that gives you an idea. I don't know what that is in homebrew level, a couple ounces, something like that. But getting the right raw material is, I think, a good start, and just being able to be patient with it.
Absolutely, and don't be afraid to use a carboy. I mean, it's difficult to fill up a home brewery with a ton of barrels. And actually, I've seen data that says actually the oxygen pickup in a carboy is actually a little greater than you get out of an oak barrel, even with the rubber stopper on the top of the carboy. So you're still going to be getting some of that O2 to drive the fermentation over time. I mean, if you want a little bit of oak character, you can always add some chips or some cubes after the fact, or spirals. Personally, I don't like a whole lot of oak character in this style of beer. Actually, when I took some of our unfruited spontaneous beer over to have people like Jean Venois from Cantillon or Yvonne de Bates from De La Seine taste it, they had very nice things to say, but they commented that it was a little oakier than traditional lambic and goose. And I think that has to do with we're a very young American brewery that's been using oak puncheons for a couple years. They've been using these same oak puncheons for decades, and so I think minimal oak character is fine with this style. So I would create a little mini cool ship, do a turbid mash, get some of those aged hops that Chase referenced, do an extended boil, let it sit out overnight. Chase has made really incredible spontaneous beer just outside, so it doesn't necessarily need to be inside of this, oak surrounded room. And then, yeah, like Chase said, let it rip. I wouldn't talk you out of just using carboys and then see how it develops, and then, create a blend.
First of all, your beers rock. All right. Was there some specific event that moved you into commercial brewing? And what are your backgrounds?
I became a professional brewer before I graduated from college. So it's just been something I've been fortunate enough. I think the timing of the growth of the industry allowed me to basically pursue it as my profession. So I didn't necessarily leave one thing to be in this world. It was something that while I was finishing school, the right opportunities came along. Because I started as a home brewer in college, and by the last year of college, I was fortunate enough to be plugged in with the brewery in Oklahoma City. And when that brewery opened in like 2009, I sent a letter to the Sunday session, to the Brewing Network, thanking them for the information I had learned. And then Justin actually read it on the air when I got started. But so my background has basically been beer.
Yeah, my background is strictly amateur. I've never worked professionally at any other brewery prior to Jester King. What I would do is I got into home brewing, got the home brewing bug, got a job at Austin Homebrew in Austin, started working there. And I would just got to the point where maybe like 3 or 4 days a week, I was just in my garage, brewing a batch, and I had my, podcasts in my ear, and I was listening to Jamil Zainashev, John Palmer, all the brewers that Justin would bring on to the Sunday session. And that was just a wealth of knowledge. And just basically learned to brew by just like listening to like every single BN show ever.
All right, so flashback to when you were first starting, right? A lot of these styles very nascent. What gave you the confidence to pursue this direction and build the business?
I tried it on a small scale and it kind of worked. So like I was just like, we were at a point where all the other beers we were making was really keeping our company in really good shape. So it just gave me the wiggle room to pursue it and not be scared of it failing. So it's been a little bit of a confidence kick from a few years ago and thinking that this is actually working. To each year I get a little deeper and a little more invested in it, and I add barrel stock. And so each year I'm probably adding about 50 to 60 barrels worth of production to this project. It took a small nudge of success, and then it's just been the willingness to keep getting deeper and deeper into it, I suppose, mostly for me.
I mean, definitely. A lot of our inspiration relates back to our philosophy of trying to link a beer to a time and a place and kind of have something unique and relevant to contribute to the beer world. I looked around when I was opening Jester King, and I saw some really beautiful German and English and American styles of beer being made in Austin, but I felt that farmhouse ale was something that really wasn't represented in Austin or Texas. And then also Jolly Pumpkin was a huge influence. Getting to taste those. I had a friend who was living in Ann Arbor who sent me a couple 750 ml bottles of La Roja and Oro de Calabaza, and like, you got to try these beers. These beers are insane, and I totally was blown away by them too. And similar to wanting to basically take inspiration from the process of lambic and goose, Jester King is really based upon just looking at what Ron Jeffries did at Jolly Pumpkin and wanting to take that same procedure but do it with all of our own native ingredients so as to express that time and place.
Isn't it cool he's like our bud now?
You talked about your natural area. When you guys started your brew pub, was there a reason why you selected the site you selected? Did you guys do some research on the natural flora growing in that area, or was it just by random luck that you came up to an environment where it has these microbes that will grow wonderful sour beers? And thank you for sharing these sour beers. Really appreciate it.
So the straight answer for us would be no. I mean, we are on a beautiful ranch in the Texas Hill Country, and we totally lucked into it. Our name was in the paper as a brewery in planning, and this rancher said, "How would you like to lease some land out of my ranch?" And that was like a no-brainer. We're like, let's do it. I guess and this is all like very new stuff to me, but I maybe want to like at least just suddenly like question the notion of needing to be around like these idyllic fruit orchards or rolling fields to make these spontaneous styles of beer. I mean, again, not to speak for Chase, but I mean his brewery is not in a rural, it's close to Tulsa. Our brewery, there's a lot of land around it, but we've taken our cool ship, moved it to other places to see if we can still achieve spontaneous fermentation, and the beer goes. I mean, like Chase said, you let it rip and it happens. And I kind of feel like this like really kind of like gnarly wort that we create with like the turbid mash that has a lot of like dextrins and the aged hops where it's kind of bitter. I almost feel like that style of wort is going to kind of create it's got enough built-in protection mechanisms to, I think, kind of like survive and make good beer regardless if it's like in a cherry orchard or in an urban environment.
Yeah, the thing for me is when I picked my spot, I was a small brewer that had no budget, no investment. I've just done everything as we've grown to pay for things. So I just had an economical spot for me to get started. Like I said, just scraping the cash together to open a building up. So we are quite close to a Arkansas River that flows through town, a few hundred yards probably from it. But I mean, our brewery's like next to a scrapyard. It's kind of crappy. So I'd love to have a romantic place for us to be located in soon, but just my philosophy and how I've approached my business, I proceed with probably too much caution, and fortunately it's kind of worked where we are, but it would be cool to be in a cool spot like that. All sorts of
All right, guys. Hey, tasting that amazing beer, I could not be more flattered that we influenced you and helped you learn. Thank you for all your kind words. You got me all choked up back there. Thanks for coming, everybody. We're out of time, unfortunately. Round of applause for these guys. Jeffrey and Chase, thanks for all your time. We got another one coming up in just about 10 minutes. We're going to be doing pleasure through variety. Who doesn't believe in that, right? So come on back for another panel. Thanks, everybody.
The Brewing Network.